So a few weeks ago, I got to services at White Sands Buddhist Center and somehow managed to not know that the previous day there had been a major tragedy. And so, because I just hadn't happened to look at the news that morning. So now before I leave to go to services anywhere, I always check. We live in very challenging times, as you know. Rita mentioned a few of the issues we face. The burning rainforest is a prime example. Terrible acts of violence take place more often than I care to think about. And we continue to get dire warnings about climate change. And the McCain Institute, I think, is doing a wonderful thing by asking us to commit acts of civility. But it's sad that civility has fallen so low in our national priorities. Almost 88% of Americans think that a lack of civility in politics is a major issue. And I got to say, in my lifetime, politics has been pretty divisive several times, but it's probably as bad as I've seen it ever. And we're facing this long election season. And you can bet that there's going to be plenty of anger and fear feeding our society's state of mind. So situations like this leave us with a mixture of strong emotions, anger and sadness and fear. And as Rita read before, as a Buddhist, I'm committed to non-anger and non-fear and non-hatred. And more often I'm asked, how do you maintain compassion and equanimity in the face of suffering like this? Well, the Buddha also lived in a time of great change. In India 2,600 years ago, many people suffered from the kind of scarcity and disease and afflictions of mind and body and society, some of which is almost unimaginable to us today. And it was because he recognized the existence of such great suffering that he left his palace to live the holy life. And once he had achieved awakening, he didn't just simply live a life of solitary bliss out in the forest, although he could have. But he decided to return to the mundane world and advise everyone from outcasts to kings how to live fuller, more authentic lives. And so how can we do that? How can we live authentically when we're in the midst of so much context that is not authentic? How can we practice mindfulness in a society driven by mindlessness? How can we maintain compassion when there's so many reasons to be angry? So we learn as Buddhists that we have Buddha nature, that at our heart lies the ability to fully awaken. And so when it comes to things like violence and climate catastrophes and social conflict and hunger, what would a Buddha do? Our great practice is to free ourselves from the bondage of greed and hatred and delusion. And those mental states come in a number of forms, and they have internal and external causes and effects. They harm our minds, and they arise in our minds. And they also can cause harm to others, and thus to our society. So part of our practice is to deal with what arises in our mind. And to deal with what arises in society is the other part of our practice. So as individuals, we try to minimize the effects of these things on our hearts. And as members of society, we try to minimize their effect on our world. So the problem for a lot of us is how to address the effects on society without increasing the effects on our hearts and minds. We have to be careful that our concern for others doesn't cross the line into hatred or attachment. For instance, it's human nature to identify with certain groups of people that we see as similar to ourselves. But then once we do that, we can easily fall into a pattern of emphasizing our differences from other groups. And that can easily turn into demonizing or dehumanizing others who are not members of our own sort of tribe, so to speak. So think about the relationship between an oppressed group and the oppressor. Both of them can fall into a pattern of hatred that sustains the conflict. The oppressor uses hatred to maintain its delusion of superiority. The oppressed can use its hatred to justify violent resistance. In both cases, bad actions are used to justify more bad actions. And so it can become a spiral cycle of violence and suffering that just gets bigger and bigger. So when we feel an urge to lash out, we should remind ourselves of this. If we see a target for our anger, we should remind ourselves of how that cycle of hatred works, and then see a target for kindness. If we believe that a world based on wisdom and compassion is better than a world based on delusion and hatred, then we have to force ourselves to work within a structure defined by wisdom and compassion. That means not allowing ourselves to be seduced by the appeal of anger and attachment. You can't grow wiser by cultivating delusion. So a lot of people hear about the Buddhist view of anger and greed and attachment and thinks that that means that we shouldn't have emotion. But that would mean that we abandon our humanity. And that's not what we're about at all. That wouldn't be authentic. But we can regulate our emotions. We don't have to cut them off. That won't work even if we try it. They just come out in strange, weird ways. But when an emotion arises, we can use our reactions to that with mindfulness and skill. Sometime back, there was a visiting master from Vietnam over at White Sands, and he gave this Dharma talk, and he was talking about anger, and he compared it to taking a shower. And he said, you know, if you get into the shower, you've got dials where you can make the water hotter or colder, and sometimes you want a hot shower, and sometimes you want a cold shower. He says it's the same thing with emotions. You can regulate how hot or cold your emotions are. And so you can use your emotions to kind of help you go where you want to go. The Buddha compared the emotions to horses pulling a chariot. He said you don't just drop the reins and let the horses run wild, but you also don't unhitch the horses, because then your chariot won't get anywhere. A true charioteer holds onto the reins and guides the horses so they take you where you need to go. But repeatedly he said that hatred can only be conquered by non-hatred. There's one story I think that particularly illustrates the Buddha's attitude toward this kind of thing. After his enlightenment, he would sometimes go back home where he grew up to visit the Sakyas, the clan that he was born into. And on one of these trips home, there was a conflict between the Sakyans and their neighbors, the Kolyas. And these two clans had dammed up a river in order to create kind of a reservoir between the two cities in order to store up water for their crops. And it had been a drought, and so there hadn't been a lot of rain, and so the reservoir was a little down, and they were arguing over who could use the water. And these two headmen had started this argument and eventually turned into a brawl. And there was name calling and all kinds of misbehavior and, saying things about each other's mothers and stuff like that. And so eventually they decided they would go to war. Well, the Buddha went out at dawn and he saw his kinsmen gathering together for a battle. And he started going around and asking people, what are you going to war for? And nobody knew. They knew they were mad at each other about something, but the cause of it had sort of been lost in all of this. So he went to his father, who was the king of the Sakyas, and he said, so I understand after asking around that you're getting ready to go over to war, and I think it's over water. And he said, how much is water worth? And the king said, well, it's pretty cheap. It falls out of the sky. And then the Buddha said, well, how much are your kinsmen worth? And the king said, well, kinsmen are priceless. Is it fitting then that because of a little water, that which has almost no value in terms of money, you would sacrifice some kinsmen, those who are priceless? And then he got both kings together and he said, you're greedy, but you're enslaved. You're enslaved by your own desires. You're living in strife when you can be free from that. You're afflicted from hatred when you can be free from poison. The Buddha did advise kings that they should provide protection for their people, and he understood that the defensive use of force could sometimes be necessary. He was a realist. But he stressed in his advice that they should always measure the use of any violence against a higher standard, and he never glorified or praised any form of it. It's interesting that watching the video of if may nothing evil cross this door. There was one shot, and it's brief, and the camera's panning across the room, and it shows the Dalai Lama, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. And this wasn't planned, but I'm going to mention all three of them because they're really good representatives of how you can really take this principle of nonviolence and the idea of compassion as a way to defend yourself against violence and put it to good use. The Dalai Lama gave that famous speech when he accepted the Nobel Prize, and he said, if we want to have peace in the world, we have to first have peace in our hearts. If anybody ever had the idea of supporting a just war, he probably does. As you probably know, the Maoists invaded Tibet, did massive amounts of destruction, and sent people and religious leaders all over the world seeking refuge. But the Dalai Lama insists that while he gets angry at Mao and the communists, he works very hard not to let it find a foothold in his mind. And so he said Mao was his greatest teacher. Well, if the Dalai Lama can see Mao as a great teacher, probably most of us can regulate our feelings toward the difficult people that we have to contend with. It's not enough just to recognize that violence is harmful, to commit to refraining from it, or to decide to work against it. We have to first understand it, and we also have to understand peace. Think about how we train our minds when we meditate. You can't just stop harmful thoughts. They arise. You can't do anything to prevent that. But we can direct the mind in a more skillful direction. So to stop the mind from creating stress, we build mindfulness and concentration and compassion. So likewise, in order to battle violence against a particular group, we have to understand that violence stands with this triad of different kinds of violence, direct violence and cultural violence and structural violence. So violence in society takes these three forms: direct violence like the mass shootings that we've seen, or separating children from their parents. That's direct violence. And direct violence is supported by structural violence. We can separate a mother from her child because they're breaking the law. Never mind that the law is unjust and impractical. We can allow mass shootings to continue by banning funding for research that might limit the availability of guns. Both direct and structural violence are supported by cultural violence. We justify them by dehumanizing the people affected. For instance, by saying that certain groups of people are terrorists, or they're murderers, or they're gang members, or they're sexual criminals. We can encourage a culture of a gun culture without questioning whether that might be a good idea or not. This tripod stands on a foundation that I think is kind of the fourth part of violence: inner violence. If our minds are set on greed, on hatred, and delusion, it's very difficult to dismantle that triad of violence. So if we want to build a peaceful world, we have to build a triad of direct peace, of structural peace, of cultural peace. We have to favor people over profits and compassion over greed. And we need a structure that supports that. Laws that ensure that we don't turn our backs on those less fortunate. Laws that create equity between individuals and groups. And we need a culture that values kindness. So I applaud the McCain Institute for supporting the need for civility. That's a step in the right direction. But we also need to understand that we are interdependent. If we've turned our backs on one of our brothers and sisters, we've turned our backs on the world. And we've made ourselves an island in a stormy sea in the process. And we need a foundation for that kind of peace to stand on, and that foundation starts by building peace in our hearts. So yes, we should battle injustice in the world. But we have to remember first to battle any violence created by greed, anger, and delusion in our hearts. And we have two weapons for our battle: wisdom and compassion. Wisdom is the ability to see things as they really are, and to know which of our actions of body, speech, and mind lead to freedom, and which lead to suffering. And compassion is the heartfelt wish to spare others from suffering. Every religion recognizes the value of compassion. And yet the society turns away from that over and over again. So we need to bring ourselves back to that again and again. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is probably one of history's best examples of this. He fought hard for justice, but in the process he honored his own commitments to loving humanity. He actually took as his model Mahatma Gandhi, who had led India to independence through nonviolent action. I've used this example before here probably, but it bears repeating. Most of you probably know the theme of Dr. King's most famous speech. I had a dream. That's the one he gave during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom 56 years ago this month, just a few days from now, August 28th, 1963. Imagine that instead of I have a dream, Dr. King had gone to Washington, marched from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, climbed the steps and complained, I have a list of complaints. He did, you know, but would that speech be as memorable? Would we all have known the name of that speech? Probably not. So King took his inspiration from Gandhi. Believe it or not, Gandhi took his inspiration from Jesus. Gandhi felt that responsible members of society should be familiar with the scriptures of all major religions. And so he was moved by the exhortation in the Bible to first seek the kingdom of heaven before turning away from evil. So why would a Buddhist worry about the kingdom of heaven? Well, we have this concept called the Brahma Viharas. Metta, which is the wish that all beings be happy and well. Compassion, which we invoke when we wish to help those others who are suffering. Grateful joy and equanimity. And those mental states we call the Brahma Viharas. And Brahma refers to the highest divine nature. In Indian cosmology, that's the highest divinity. Vihara means dwelling place. So you could translate this as the divine abode, or you could translate it as the kingdom of heaven. So if you want to follow the example set by people like King and Gandhi, first seek goodwill, compassion, grateful joy, and balance of mind in your own heart. And then set out to create peace and justice in your world. So I'm going to give you a moment of silence.